Smoke drifted above the marshes of Mystic, carrying the scent of burned thatch and ash. Before dawn, cries had echoed across the valley and silence followed like a verdict. No one yet called it genocide, but the ground was already claiming that word. To understand how it came to this, we must step backward, into the years when fear began to speak louder than trade. And as you listen now, maybe you're far from those quiet Connecticut valleys. Perhaps in Boston, walking home through city lights, or in San Francisco, sipping your evening coffee beside the window, or maybe in Toronto, settling into bed with the hum of distant traffic outside. Wherever you are, this moment in history still whispers across the centuries. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you value keeping these forgotten stories alive, subscribe. It truly helps keep the past from fading. Now back to the story. The Pequots had stood as the strongest nation between the Thames and the Connecticut, their villages bound by wampum, harvest, and trust. Their sachems ruled through kinship, diplomacy, and measured power, maintaining order among dozens of smaller groups. English colonists arrived with open Bibles and closed boundaries, marking lands never offered for sale. At first, gifts of maize and furs crossed hands, yet suspicion shadowed every gesture. The Dutch traded powder, the English demanded loyalty, and the Pequots found themselves surrounded by promises sharpened like blades. Long before muskets flared at Mystic, the war had already begun in words, in fear, and in every boundary drawn without consent. It began quietly, with negotiations that hardened into threats and ended in smoke that carried the name of a people nearly erased from their homeland's memory. The Connecticut River Valley in the 1630s was more than wilderness to the English. It was a vision of order waiting to be claimed. To the Pequots, it was homeland, where every stream carried ancestral memory and every hill held the bones of kin. Settlers arriving from Massachusetts read the land differently. Unploughed soil meant waste, and open forest meant invitation. Palisades rose where hunting paths once wound between birch and oak. Boundaries that had once shifted with the seasons were now marked with fences and paper deeds. Disputes began quietly, with trespass, debts, and broken trade promises. English merchants accused the Pequots of theft. Pequot elders accused them of deceit. The Dutch armed rivals, hoping to hold their trade, and every alliance became a wager. In villages along the coast, elders warned that balance was slipping. For the English, Providence seemed to open the land for their faith. For the Pequots, spirits grew silent. Diplomacy, once their strength, became a web tightening around them, and in the quiet between meetings and sermons, both sides began to ready their weapons, sensing the storm that would one day reach every clearing, every shore, and every remembered name along the river. By 1634, mistrust took its first life. Captain John Stone, an English trader notorious for smuggling and violence, was killed on the Connecticut River. The English quickly blamed the Pequots, though witnesses claimed it was the retaliation of Western Niantics. Facts mattered less than convenience. The death became a reason for punishment. Massachusetts officials demanded reparations, hostages, and public submission. To the Pequots, such demands meant humiliation before their enemies. They sent envoys seeking calm, but Puritan leaders answered with sermons on sin and divine retribution. Every word widened the distance between worlds. When another trader, John Oldham, was slain near Block Island in 1636, outrage deepened into policy. The English formed militias. Ships were armed for coastal raids. The Pequots fortified villages, knowing peace was slipping away. Rumours spread faster than messengers, of raids, captives, and burned canoes. What began as 2 murders became a justification for conquest. In Puritan towns, ministers preached that God had delivered them an enemy. Along the Thames, Pequot warriors sharpened arrows beneath quiet fires, uncertain which dawn would bring the first attack. The fragile thread of coexistence had already snapped, though neither side yet spoke the word war. Through the winter of 1636, the line between negotiation and warfare vanished. English forces, joined by Mohegan allies led by Uncas, began punitive raids along the Pequot coast. Villages were burned under the claim of divine justice, and survivors scattered into frozen swamps. Each strike brought more vengeance, each treaty more deceit. The Pequots watched alliances shift like tides, Narragansetts drawn toward the English, Mohegans abandoning old kinship bonds. Trade routes once filled with canoes now carried only smoke. English settlers built blockhouses near the Thames, marking a frontier that crept deeper every month. At Saybrook, muskets guarded storehouses where once only beaver pelts had been weighed. In council lodges, Pequot elders debated how long restraint could hold before honour demanded reply. Sassacus, their sachem, urged unity, calling warriors from distant villages. He saw that surrender meant disappearance, and survival required defiance. Each campfire became a council, each night a warning. To the colonists, this defiance confirmed guilt. To the Pequots, it was proof of life. The frost that sealed the marshes could not quiet the message carried on the wind. That war was no longer approaching. It was already here, waiting in the woods beyond the pale fences. By early spring, both sides had chosen their path. The English saw themselves as instruments of providence, tasked with cleansing rebellion from the land. Sermons in Hartford and Boston spoke of righteous conquest, of pagans defying divine order. Across the rivers, Pequot scouts moved through leafless thickets, marking the movement of ships and militias. Every settlement, every trail became a test of endurance. Women hid stores of corn, children carried embers to rebuild fires after raids. For the first time, the Pequots faced not a rival tribe, but an enemy seeking their erasure. They had survived disease, famine, and shifting power, but this new war carried a doctrine: complete submission or destruction. Sassacus gathered his council at the western village of Winechokes, his words solemn. "If we bend now, our children will have no names." Messengers ran through the night to summon every ally still loyal. The forest seemed smaller, the sky lower, the future narrower with each passing moon. As dawn spread over the frozen river mouths, smoke from English chimneys rose in answer, signalling readiness. The first volleys had not yet been fired, yet the Pequot War had already found its purpose: conquest disguised as divine deliverance. The killing of Captain John Stone in 1634 did not begin as a war, yet it set the path for one. Stone was a trader and privateer whose reputation for violence reached every river settlement. When his ship anchored along the Connecticut River, conflict followed. He and his crew were slain. Some reports said by Niantics retaliating for past abuse. Others claimed Pequot hands. The English made no distinction. To the colonial mind, Stone's death demanded divine punishment. From Boston to Saybrook, ministers framed it as proof of Pequot treachery. Orders went out for restitution, demanding hostages and wampum. Sassacus refused. Knowing compliance meant surrender. The Pequots sent envoys to explain the truth, but their voices carried no weight against sermons and suspicion. English leaders declared that the killing revealed the savagery of a nation unfit for peace. Ships armed with cannon moved along the coast, scouting Pequot harbours under the banner of investigation. For the Pequots, this was the moment understanding failed. The bridge between diplomacy and violence collapsed. The death of one trader had become a cause for judgment, and in its shadow, every Pequot village now waited for punishment disguised as justice. By 1636, tensions had hardened into open hostility. The murder of another trader, John Oldham, near Block Island, turned rumour into crusade. Oldham's death was not Pequot work. Narragansett informants confirmed it came from discontented Manisses. But Puritan authorities saw a larger enemy and placed blame where it served expansion. Governor Vane and the Massachusetts Bay magistrates declared the Pequots responsible for fostering rebellion. They sent Captain John Endicott with 90 men to exact retribution. Endicott's orders were clear: seize hostages, burn villages, destroy crops. His men sailed to Block Island, then moved along the Pequot coast, attacking settlements that had offered no resistance. Bark lodges burned, stores of corn were destroyed, and those who fled were hunted through reeds and marshes. The English called it a message of strength. The Pequots saw it as unprovoked invasion. Survivors carried word to Sassacus, who now understood that no negotiation could end this conflict. In Boston, sermons praised God for victory. In the forests, the Pequots prepared for vengeance. The brief trade dispute had evolved into open war, one that neither side could now escape without blood. When English forces withdrew after the raids, they left behind more than ashes. They left a nation humiliated and enraged. Pequot warriors scouted the coastlines, counting the villages reduced to smoke. Sassacus summoned his council, urging every sachem to unite before more ships arrived. The elders agreed that retaliation was now a matter of survival. Raiding parties struck isolated farms near the Connecticut River, burning houses and reclaiming corn taken by settlers. To the colonists, these reprisals confirmed their fears. To the Pequots, it was the only language the English seemed to understand. In Hertford and Wethersfield, families fortified homes and slept behind boarded doors. The colonies petitioned for more troops, calling for an alliance with the Narragansetts and Mohegans. Rival tribes saw opportunity in Pequot weakness. Uncas of the Mohegans turned toward the English, seeking advantage in their growing power. The war had become more than vengeance. It was reshaping the balance of tribes across New England. Within months, roads that once carried trade now echoed with soldiers' boots, and every firelight on the horizon marked another village forced to choose sides between survival and extinction. In the spring of 1637, the English colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts joined forces, determined to end the conflict by destroying the Pequot as a political power. Captain John Mason took command of newly trained militia supported by Mohegan scouts. The plan was no longer punitive, it was extermination through conquest. Settlers in fortified towns gathered supplies, while ministers preached of holy deliverance from heathen cruelty. Across the river valleys, Pequot scouts watched columns of armed men move toward their homelands. Villages were emptied, women and children relocated into swamps and islands for safety. The Pequots struck first, ambushing small patrols and raiding Saybrook's outposts. These attacks caused panic among settlers but could not slow the invasion. Mason's men advanced methodically, burning everything that might sustain their enemy. Each encounter deepened the cruelty on both sides. Captives were tortured, prisoners executed without hesitation. What had begun as scattered reprisal was now an organized campaign to erase a nation. By late spring, Mason's army approached the Mystic River, where the largest Pequot village stood behind tall palisades, its people unaware that their destruction was already planned and waiting in the dark of an approaching dawn. News of the approaching army spread through Pequot territory like a whispered storm. Messengers crossed rivers and marshes, warning that the English came with fire, Mohegans, and Narragansetts beside them. Sassacus called his warriors together, numbering several hundred to defend their main strongholds at Mystic and Winchawks. The decision was divided. Some leaders urged retreat inland, others argued to hold their ground. They believed their palisades strong enough, their spirits bound by courage and ancestors. Inside the villages, women packed maize and water gourds, while warriors painted faces in ash and ochre. Scouts returned with reports of English troops building boats and gathering supplies. For days the air hung heavy with smoke from distant fires. The Pequots understood this war was unlike any before. It sought not territory, but their removal from existence. Sassacus vowed to fight until no warrior stood. In the coastal dawns, canoes waited hidden under reeds, ready to strike supply lines or rescue fleeing families. Every night the fires burned low and silent, their glow masked from the shore. The Pequot nation braced itself, not for victory, but for survival against an enemy that had already chosen annihilation as its purpose. By early May 1637, open war consumed the Connecticut frontier. English militias and their native allies moved village to village, torching every settlement suspected of harbouring Pequots. Smoke marked their path from the coast to the river valleys. Sassacus ordered his warriors to abandon open fields and fight from the forests, using ambushes along trails and rivers. Pequot raiders struck at Wethersfield, killing settlers and taking prisoners to exchange later for peace. To the colonists, the attack confirmed that the entire Pequot nation was now the enemy. English towns armed every man, while ministers declared the conflict sacred and inevitable. The Narragansett and Mohegan joined under English command, eager to settle rival scores. For the Pequots, this betrayal cut deeper than battle itself. Their kin turned into guides for their pursuers. Fields once filled with corn now smouldered beneath clouds of ash. Canoes were overturned, villages emptied, and survivors drifted toward Mystic. Across New England, the rhythm of life shifted from trade to fear. No road was safe, no harbour neutral. Both sides had passed the point of return, and what began as retribution had become a struggle for total survival. The English War Council at Hartford resolved to end the conflict swiftly through decisive destruction. Captain John Mason gathered 90 soldiers, while Captain John Underhill brought another 20 from Massachusetts Bay. They were joined by several hundred Mohegan and Narragansett warriors. Each side saw different reasons for war: English expansion, Mohegan ambition, and Narragansett vengeance. Together they advanced along the Pequot trails, burning smaller villages as warnings. Mason understood that defeating the Pequots required breaking their will to resist. He chose to strike at Mystic, their largest stronghold, believing that one overwhelming blow would end the war. The march was slow, burdened by wet spring ground and dwindling supplies. Every night, scouts reported Pequot movement nearby, unseen yet constant. The Allied force slept in shifts, their muskets kept close, fires shielded from view. Along the coast, Pequot sentinels shadowed them silently through the trees. In each camp, English soldiers prayed aloud, while native allies painted their faces for battle. The two worlds, European and tribal, shared the same fires yet trusted neither the flame nor each other. Ahead, in the mist beyond the Mystic River, the Pequot stronghold waited, unaware that the coming dawn would bring their world to the edge of extinction. As Mason's force approached the lower valley, Pequot scouts watched from the shadows, tracking their movement with precision. Every column of smoke rising from the soldiers' camp signaled danger. The Pequots struck at night, firing arrows into tents and melting back into the forest before a musket could flash. The English, unused to this style of war, grew restless and frightened. Their armour slowed them, their formations failed in thickets and swamps. Mason learned to adapt, using Mohegan and Narragansett scouts to read the trails, to turn ambush into counterattack. In return, the Allies guided him toward Mystic, though some questioned the morality of what was coming. Along the rivers, English reinforcements secured boats to block escape, ensuring the Pequot would have nowhere left to flee. Villages fell one after another, each burning brighter than the last. The cries of displaced families echoed across the marshes. Sassacus gathered what warriors remained, ordering them to defend Mystic with everything they had. For both sides, faith carried the same conviction, that God or the spirits demanded endurance to the end. And as the sun sank behind the trees, each camp prepared for a confrontation that could end an entire people's history. The Pequot stronghold at Mystic stood atop a small hill, surrounded by a double palisade of tree trunks, inside which more than 400 men, women and children sheltered. It was not merely a fortress, it was a town with longhouses, drying racks and stores of food gathered for summer. Mason's army reached it on May 25th, hiding in nearby woods as darkness fell. Inside the village, the Pequots believed the English force had turned back toward the coast. Warriors sang around low fires, unaware of the approach. Mason met with his officers beneath a cluster of oaks and planned a dawn assault from two directions. The Mohegan and Narragansett allies would surround the rear, cutting off escape. Muskets were checked, powder flasks sealed from dew. Underhill prayed quietly, asking divine sanction for what was about to occur. The stillness of the night seemed unnatural, broken only by the rustle of armour and the distant cry of a night bird. Beyond the river, 1,000 lives waited behind walls that would soon burn. The English soldiers slept in silence, knowing they would attack at first light, and that the rising smoke would change the name of Mystic forever. Dawn approached beneath a grey horizon, and mist clung to the marshes around Mystic. Mason's men moved into position, their boots muffled in the damp grass. The Pequot sentinel saw movement too late. A musket fired, the signal, and chaos erupted. English soldiers surged toward the gates while native allies encircled the rear. Pequot warriors fought back fiercely with bows and spears, but the wooden walls trapped their own defence. Mason ordered the lodges set aflame. Fire leapt from roof to roof as smoke rolled through the enclosure. Within minutes the village became an inferno. Those who fled through gaps in the walls were cut down by sword or shot. The Mohegans and Narragansetts recoiled at the slaughter, horrified by its scale. Yet the English pressed on until silence replaced screams. More than 400 Pequots perished in less than an hour. When it ended, Mason looked upon the ashes and declared that God had judged his enemies. The survivors who escaped into the woods carried only grief and disbelief. The Pequot War had reached its turning point, the moment when retaliation transformed into annihilation, and the fate of a nation was sealed beneath rising smoke and broken earth. The night before the assault, the English camp lay in silence near the Mystic River. Soldiers slept lightly, their armour beside them, while Mohegan and Narragansett allies kept watch at the tree line. Mason walked the perimeter, checking match cords and powder horns, pausing often to listen to the wind. Across the dark valley, faint torches flickered within the Pequot fort, unaware of what was coming. Within the walls, families rested around dying fires, children slept near drying racks, and warriors leaned their weapons by the entrances. The faint sound of drums and laughter carried into the distance, a final echo of ordinary life, The attackers moved before dawn, crossing the river in darkness and forming two lines. Mason commanded the main force, Underhill the other. Clouds hung low, holding the smoke near the ground. Each man was ordered to advance quietly until the first shot. In those final moments before dawn, both armies, one awake, one dreaming, existed in a single fragile stillness. It was the last hour the Pequots would know peace. As light began to grey the horizon, the English raised their muskets, and the war transformed from pursuit to annihilation. The attack began just after sunrise on May 26, 1637. Mason's men rushed the eastern gate, while Underhill's troops pressed from the south. The first volley of musket fire broke the morning silence, striking warriors who tried to rally near the entrance. Pequot defenders fought back with arrows, their cries echoing across the valley. Inside the fort, panic spread. Women and children ran for cover as smoke thickened from burning thatch. Mason, realizing the palisades were too strong to breach, ordered the lodges set aflame. Torches and powder flasks ignited the village within minutes. Fire raced along bark roofs feeding on dry timber. Warriors trapped between flames and musket lines fell one by one. The heat drove both armies back, yet the smoke revealed figures trying to escape through gaps in the walls. Mohegan and Narragansett allies, horrified by the slaughter, called for mercy, but the English fired without pause. The screams, mingled with the crack of muskets, filled the morning air until only the roar of fire remained. When the flames subsided, the fort was gone, its people consumed in smoke that carried their last voices over the marshes of Mystic. When the flames finally died, the English entered the ruins, stepping carefully through embers and ash. The ground was strewn with bodies, many still unrecognisable. Mason wrote later that 600 were slain, though few cared to count precisely. Survivors, mostly women and children, were taken captive or executed nearby. The Mohegans and Narragansetts stood apart, shaken by the scale of destruction. What they had imagined as victory now looked like desecration. Mason, however, framed the event as providence fulfilled, claiming divine favour for the slaughter. He and Underhill ordered their men to gather weapons and corn before retreating. The stench of burned flesh lingered over the valley for days. Pequot scouts returning from nearby villages found only silence, the fort reduced to blackened ground. They carried news to Sassacus, who refused to believe it until he saw the ashes himself. The loss at Mystic was not just defeat, it shattered the spiritual and political heart of the Pequot nation. In the colonial towns, bells rang in celebration. In the forests, mourning songs began. Between them stretched a land divided by blood, where victory had replaced mercy, and the word Pequot had become a sentence. The English force withdrew toward the coast, pursued by surviving Pequot warriors. Along the way, ambushes struck from the reeds and thickets, arrows cutting through the marching columns. Mason's troops responded with gunfire, burning any shelter they passed. The retreat became another campaign of destruction, turning victory into scorched earth. Behind them, the Mystic site smouldered for weeks, drawing scavengers and the grieving alike. Sassacus gathered the remnants of his people and fled westward toward the Mohawk, hoping for refuge. The journey was marked by starvation, wounds, and betrayal. Many captives were killed on sight. Others were taken by Mohegans and Narragansetts as slaves or spoils. In the English towns, proclamations declared the Pequot power broken. Ministers preached that God had purged the wilderness of evil. Yet even among soldiers, unease grew. Some whispered that what they had done went beyond war. Along the shoreline, families scavenged through abandoned canoes and shattered pottery, reminders of a people erased within a single morning. The victory at Mystic was celebrated as deliverance, but it also marked the moment when New England learned that conquest could wear the face of faith. In the weeks that followed, English patrols scoured the coast and river valleys for any Pequot survivors. Small groups were hunted through the swamps and captured near the Thames. Sassacus led what remained of his warriors toward the interior, pursued relentlessly. The Mohegans and Narragansetts, now bound by alliance and reward, joined the chase, capturing fugitives for English favour. Those taken alive were sold into slavery in Bermuda, or given to allied tribes as servants. Children were divided among colonial households, their names erased. The Pequot homeland was partitioned between Connecticut and its allies, its villages renamed and resettled. Laws forbade any person from speaking the Pequot name again. By summer's end, the nation that had ruled the southeastern coast no longer existed as a people. In its place stood cleared fields, forts and farms, the architecture of conquest. For the colonists, it was the birth of security. For New England's native nations, it was a warning. The Pequot War had begun as punishment, ended as extermination, and entered history as the first recorded genocide in North America. The land remembered, even if men pretended not to. When the fires of Mystic faded, the English turned to the work of erasing what remained. Colonial leaders divided Pequot lands among the victors, Connecticut, the Mohegans, and the Narragansetts, each taking portions of soil soaked with ash. Sassacus and his surviving warriors fled westward toward the Mohawk, hoping to rebuild an alliance, but the Mohawk killed them and sent their scalps to the English as proof of loyalty. Those who escaped capture hid in small bands, scattered across the swamps and islands of Long Island Sound. Colonial patrols moved constantly, burning shelters and tracking smoke by day. Captured women and children were bound in rope and marched to the coast for shipment to Bermuda as slaves. Ministers recorded that the Lord had made a name for his people, declaring the extermination a sign of favour, yet in quiet some settlers whispered unease, unable to forget the screams that haunted their sleep. The Pequot nation, once the strongest power in southern New England, now existed only as fugitives without name or homeland. The war had not just ended a people's resistance, it had removed their presence from the maps and memory of a land they had shaped for centuries. By late 1637, the English declared victory official. The Treaty of Hartford outlawed the Pequot name entirely. No one was allowed to call themselves Pequot or speak the word in public. Surviving captives were divided as property among the colonies and allied tribes. Some were absorbed into the Mohegans and Narragansetts, others placed in English households as servants. Children grew under foreign names, their language forbidden, their stories silenced. The once busy Pequot villages became English farms, their cleared fields replanted with wheat and corn under new ownership. Forts rose where council fires had burned, symbols of order built over ruins. The colonists marked their victory with a day of thanksgiving, giving sermons that framed extermination as divine justice. In English towns, few questioned the cost. They saw peace and prosperity as proof of righteousness. But in the forests and along the coasts, the silence of the displaced lingered like an unanswered prayer. The land still bore the traces of old footpaths, shell middens and overgrown mounds, faint remains of a people ordered out of existence. The genocide had been thorough not only in death, but in the deliberate removal of memory itself. In the years that followed, English settlements expanded across former Pequot lands with astonishing speed. New towns rose along the Thames and Mystic rivers, Norwich, Stonington, and New London, each built on the remnants of burned villages. Stone cellars and wooden churches replaced council lodges and fields once used for maize and squash. The colonists renamed every place, stripping away the words that tied land to ancestry. Roads were cut through burial grounds and artefacts were taken as curiosities. For the English, the transformation symbolized divine triumph. For neighbouring tribes, it marked a warning of what resistance would bring. Disease, displacement and dependency followed, weakening every nation that had once shared the Pequot's alliances. The Mohegans prospered briefly under English favour, but soon found themselves bound by the same pressures: land loss, debt, and imposed law. Each passing year buried the memory of the Pequot War deeper beneath sermons and colonial record. What remained was a legend retold by those who won it, a tale of deliverance instead of destruction. Beneath the surface of the New World's order, the earth still held its own record: charred soil, scattered beads and bones that spoke of a people erased but never entirely gone. By the mid-17th century, only fragments of Pequot lineage survived. Families living under Mohegan or Narragansett protection, careful never to speak their original name. Some adapted to English customs, trading service for safety, while others quietly kept fragments of language and ritual alive. Wampum belts once used for diplomacy were hidden or sold for survival. Colonial laws barred gatherings of former Pequots, fearing they might rise again. Generations passed under silence, yet memory endured in stories whispered by elders beside fires. The children of captives carried both pain and resilience, blending into the fabric of tribes that had once been rivals. To colonial chroniclers, the Pequot War became a righteous victory, preserved in journals and sermons that celebrated divine justice. But in native remembrance, It remained a wound, the first clear sign that coexistence with the newcomers would mean surrender or extinction. Across New England, new conflicts were already forming, each echoing the same pattern of fear, faith, and erasure. What had been tested on the Pequots would soon be repeated elsewhere, until the balance of the entire continent shifted beyond return. Centuries later, the ground where Mystic once stood still carried the memory of that morning in 1637. Archaeologists uncovered burned clay, arrowheads, and fragments of wampum among the foundations of colonial farms. Local descendants of surviving families, those who had hidden their ancestry for generations, slowly reclaimed the name Pequot. In the 20th century, recognition returned through persistence rather than forgiveness. The restored Mashantucket Pequot and Eastern Pequot communities revived ceremonies, preserved language, and built museums to tell the story in their own words. What had been nearly erased endured as living proof that memory could outlast conquest. For historians, the Pequot War remains the first documented act of genocide in North America, a template for later campaigns of dispossession. The massacre at Mystic revealed how religious certainty could justify extermination, and how victory could silence truth for centuries. Yet even now, beneath the forests of Connecticut, wild maize still grows where Pequot gardens once thrived. The land remembers its caretakers, no matter how carefully their names were buried. The story that began in fire and loss survives, not as vengeance, but as evidence of endurance beyond every attempt to erase it. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.